Shakespeare is like lifting 500 pounds, and then you do television and they ask you to lift 150.
Have you ever struggled with trying to do Shakespeare? You made a good attempt, but you felt like it wasn't enough and you just gave it up? Ooh, I know that one because I've done it myself. Well, today you are in for a wonderful treat because Robert Beltran, the amazing actor and director, the lover of Shakespeare himself, is giving us a little mini master class so that we don't have to have that fear anymore. If this is your first time here, my name is Lydia Nicole, and this is Acting Smarter Now. I'm so excited, first of all, to have you back for us to have a little walkabout with Shakespeare so that actors can get a understanding who don't really delve into Shakespeare much. Because for me, I think if you can understand Shakespeare and you can at least have some semblance of it, it will help your acting in everything else, right? It's kind of like the Bible. If you can read King James, then you can read any version of the Bible.
That's right. Not only in comprehension, which is easier than speaking it, than performing it, because you can understand something and then when it comes to expressing it, that calls for different tools, right? So with a good dictionary, for instance, I have here something called a Shakespeare glossary. It's by C.T. Onions, and it's a glossary that is only concerning Shakespeare's works. So it's like a dictionary of all of Shakespeare, and it's only the words that now have a different usage than they did at the time. Often, when we're working on a part, you will think that you understand a section of it until you actually look at a certain word. The definition is different. And so when you have something like the C.T. Onion's glossary, you can look up that word, the Elizabethan meaning of the word that was in use at the time. So it's very valuable to have, along with a dictionary, a regular dictionary, but they don't often, sometimes they don't have the same usage that they did in Elizabethan times.
I love that you bring that up. And I would say to the actor that's listening or watching this that you may want to go to a secondhand store or an old bookstore and see if you can find an old dictionary so you can
Yeah.
get the fullness of words in general. I was thinking also how it applies to the classics, and that if, as an actor, you know, Shakespeare is important, as are the classics. That if you can go back, you know, to the 40s, get a dictionary from the 40s so you can understand what the word meant back then. So if you're
Yeah.
doing Clifford Oates or Mr. Williams, whoever you're reading of the classics, that you can understand it a little fuller, right? Because
Yeah.
as an actor, we don't want to just memorize our lines, but as we're going through it, we want to be able to look at the definition of those words so that we get the fullness of it.
Yeah, the fullness, the specific meaning, so that there's nothing vague. This C.T. Onion's glossary, which you can get at any bookstore, it's pretty popular with actors that are working on Shakespeare to help you find the specific meaning that Shakespeare had in mind.
So, for the beginning actor or the actor who wants to get an understanding of Shakespeare, they should have an old dictionary, an old Webster, old Oxford. They should have the Shakespeare glossary by C.T. Onions. They should have certain things ready so when they start the process, they have a better understanding.
Yes.
In preparing for Shakespeare, what are a couple of things that the actors should be aware of?
It's very crucial that people understand verse and iambic pentameter because that's the rhythm that in all of its variations, and there are lots of variations, as we're going to find out today. The iambic pentameter rhythm is crucial that you understand it, that you know what it is. That's what the thoughts are laid on, this beat. If you think about the thoughts as the melody is laid over this beat. And the beat has a lot of different variations on it, but it also helps you to find the meaning of the material that you're working on. I always use sonnets because they're complete in themselves. And I find that if you're working on a play, a section of a play, a monologue or soliloquy, a lot of times the actors haven't read the play. And so they don't have the context. And a lot of actors are very lazy and they won't read the play. They'll just go with the material in front of them. Some actors are very, very good and they will read the play or have read the play. But a lot of times they haven't read the play and they won't. So I use these 14 lines of a sonnet that's complete within itself to help students to learn verse and iambic pentameter.
So walk us through.
Okay, so I decided on Sonnet 29. First of all, I'm going to read it and then we'll break it down. The first thing that you do when you're working on a part or a sonnet is that you read it through and try to grasp as much of the meaning as you can. Sometimes you won't grasp all of it, but that's when we go back and we start to break it down so that we can understand all of it. So, Sonnet 29. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Those are the 14 lines.
Is a sonnet always 14 lines?
Yes, it's made up of 3 quatrains, 3 sections of four lines each, and a couplet at the end. Altogether, they make 14 lines. So what's important to do after you've read it, maybe spoken it to yourself for the first time, and maybe you get most of it or you don't get very much of it, it's always necessary to go back and see what the iambic pentameter rhythm can help you to have a better understanding of the sonnet. Let's just take the first line. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. Okay, so iambic pentameter is made up of 10 syllables per line, not 10 words, 10 syllables. So we have in the first line, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. Those 10 syllables are broken down into 5 parts, each part having 2 beats. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. 5 feet, they call them, 5 feet made up of 2 beats. The rhythm is unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed.
Can you give me an example of unstressed to stress?
Yes. Okay, so it goes like this. If you were to read the line in a strict iambic pentameter rhythm without thinking about sense or expression, it would be this. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. So you have an unstressed, stressed. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. That's the iambic pentameter rhythm. in that rhythm, the stress is very important to know where the stress is and what syllable of the word falls on the stress, because that helps you find the meaning of the line. That's the rhythm. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. But within that rhythm, that's the bass rhythm. That's like the clave in salsa, right? Bum, 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 with all kinds of variations that you can do on that. But you always come back to the nail, the beat. And that's the same thing with iambic pentameter rhythm. Bum, 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 has many variations. So let's take the line again. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. Okay, so the stresses are on in, grace, for, and eyes. Those are the syllables or the actual word that falls on the stress. And they are the ones that are very, very important. We're trying to find how best to express this first line, which is simply, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. That's the line. Okay. Now, if you have a variation, one variation is what you would call the inversion of the pa-pum. So it would be pa-pum, pa-pum, as a variation of the iambic pentameter rhythm, right? Instead of pa-pum, 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 pa-pum. So if we were to do this, when in, instead of when in disgrace, we would start off when in disgrace, because dis is not on the stress. When in disgrace. Okay, so this is where the actor has to figure out what is more important, when or in. What's the most important thing in this line? And so if we decide on the inversion, then you're thinking when is more important than in. When in disgrace. So we did an inversion and then we're back on the rhythm with grace. So instead of when in, we've chosen when in disgrace. We don't pronounce disgrace, some might, but it's the actual pronunciation is disgrace with the emphasis on the second syllable. Okay, so if we do the inversion instead of when in, and we decide when is more important, when in disgrace. So we had in, now instead of the stressed word, it's the unstressed word, and dis is the natural unstressed syllable in the line.
So if we're doing the inverse, when becomes the stress word, would this, this is where I got a little lost, would this be the stressed syllable instead of grace?
Good question. No, it isn't, because we don't pronounce disgrace as disgrace. You're a disgrace.
Disgraced. You're disgraced. Okay.
That's right. So that's why we know that grace in iambic pentameter rhythm naturally falls on the stress.
Okay.
So even though we've done an inversion and we've interrupted the pure iambic ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum rhythm, we've done a variation called an inversion, which is just doing the opposite. Instead of unstressed, stressed, we've done stressed, unstressed. When in disgrace, okay, now we're back on the stress, the correct stress of grace and the stressed section.
Okay.
The stressed part of when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. So in each of those stresses, except for the inversion at the beginning, each of those stresses make sense. Because if we were to say, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I mean, you can kind of figure out what's being said, but it's not as specific as when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's specific. There's no word out of place. There's no stress that's out of place unless it's a conscious choice to invert it. And that choice has to come from the actors figuring out what is most important, what is more important, when or in. In is naturally on the stress. But in this sense of the sonnet, I think when is more important.
The rhythm, the poetry is very important in Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is poetry, right?
Well, this is poetry for sure. It's in verse and it's got rhyming. So the rhyme scheme is very important. Every other line rhymes at the end, right? Eyes, first line, cries, third line, state, second line, fate, fourth line. So it's A, B is the rhyme scheme.
With the sonnet, it is poetry. I have to flow in that rhythm. But if I'm doing Shakespeare, a play, Romeo and Juliet or Midnight Summer's Dream, do I still follow that rule?
As long as it's in verse, in free verse, where you don't have rhyming lines at all, it's still written in iambic pentameter. Romeo and Juliet. What's the beginning of Romeo and Juliet? Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. Right? That's the first. That's in verse. There's lots of Shakespeare that is not written in verse, and we would call it prose, prosaic, as opposed to poetry. There's poetic and there's prosaic. And that doesn't mean that the prosaic texts in Shakespeare can't be very poetic. They are. Many of them are. That beautiful speech that Hamlet has that is not in verse, but it's so poetic. I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, foregone all custom of exercise, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. That's very poetic, but it's written in prose. So we've got to know the difference. When something's written in verse, it looks different on the page. And all you have to do is count the syllables, and it'll be clear what's verse and what is prose. Prose looks like anything that you would see in a novel. See how this looks?
Yes.
This is all prose.
Okay.
There's nothing in verse. Nothing in verse. It's just paragraph after paragraph, right? If you were to count each syllable in each sentence, it would not it would be 10, 15, 20, all over the place as far as how many syllables are in each sentence.
Right.
So this is prose. Verse, 80% of the time it has 10 syllables per line. That doesn't mean that each line is a finished thought. It just means that each line has 10 syllables. The same thought might continue for another line of 10 syllables. But here's the thing also. We'll find in this sonnet too, occasionally there's 11 syllables, but it's still verse. It's still meant to be verse. So I decided that when is more important than in.
You made that choice as an actor.
Yes, somebody may not, and it's just as valid to say when in disgrace. I choose when because we're talking about a time when something is happening, a time that has happened, a time that I'm discussing right now. When these things happen, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. Okay, that's the first line. So we did an inversion. Instead of when in, I said when in. Dis on disgrace is in the pure iambic pentameter rhythm is on the unstressed part. And so you're back on the rhythm. You're no longer doing the inversion, which would be when in disgrace. That would be continuing the inversion, and it doesn't make any sense, right? When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, it doesn't make the same sense as when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's continue with the line. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. Let's count the syllables. I all alone beweep my outcast state. 10 syllables. So basically, we do the same work that we did on the first line. We figure out what is important here for the expression of the specific thought. I all alone, or is it I all alone beweep my outcast state? Now, you might think that's a very insignificant choice to make, but I think it's very important. I all alone beweep my outcast state, or I all alone beweep my outcast state. So there's another inversion here that is a valid choice. Instead of I all alone, you could make the choice and make it a good choice. I all alone instead of I all alone. Subtle distinctions, but an actor has to know why he's going to emphasize all or I. I am inclined to use I. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone. So I do another inversion, right? I'm back on beat on lone, because that's on the stress. I all alone beweep my outcast state, the perfect iambic rhythm, except for the inversion at the top, at the beginning of the line.
What I'm understanding is how important the melody is, how important the rhythm is. You have to know what you're talking about, but you also have to abide by the rules of how you are stressing the syllables and when to stress the syllables. That is really important, so that as an actor, you may make choices, but you're still within the framework of what Shakespeare has given you. You can't be a renegade. There is a reverence to the material. There's a respect for the material. There is, you find your way, but you still have to be within the guidelines that has been given to you.
Yes, because if you're not aware of the rhythm that it's written in, the form, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you can make all kinds of mistakes that will just confuse your audience. You could say, this would be confusing. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. Did you understand the specific?
I did not.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm emphasizing words that just get in the way of the specific understanding of the line. But the thing to remember is that we are not, when we have done all the work and we're ready to perform, we're not performing a rhythm. We are performing thoughts that are laid out on this rhythm. In rehearsal, we have made choices that we're going to keep because we know that it makes sense with all the work that we did. And so the iambic pentameter is there to help you. We're not reciting a rhythm.
What I'm taking away from it is when you are singing a song, the arrangements are set, right? You have the set arrangements. You can phrase it a little different. You know, somebody who sings New York, New York, like Frank Sinatra is going to sing it a little different than Liza Minnelli, but they are still within the arrangement. They're
Yes.
not creating their own arrangement. We're giving our phrasing and our understanding, but it's got to flow within that arrangement.
Yes, that's a good analogy. The singer has the words and the melody, but there's also the orchestra that they have to follow, and they can't throw off the orchestra by doing some weird stuff with it, right? So if you've rehearsed with the orchestra, and then one night you're just going to go, New York, New York, and they're going, what the hell? That's not the way you rehearsed it. So that's what iambic pentameter is. It's the orchestra, and you're the singer.
So then it makes sense why the breath is so important within Shakespeare.
Yes. Let's talk about that for a little bit. Okay, so we've gone through the first two lines. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. That's my choice. Those are my choices. So I took a breath, whether you knew it or not, after disgrace, after eyes, and after I, and I think I took a small breath after alone. I'll do it again. When in disgrace, breath, with fortune and men's eyes, breath, I, breath, all alone, breath, beweep my outcast state, breath. These are conscious breaths that I'm taking that will help me not get ahead of myself and make the thought less clear to the audience. It's helping the audience stay with me as I express the thoughts.
I'm also thinking of the Alexander technique in that speaking on the breath, how important the breath is. The words are important, the breath is important, the rhythm is important, that we are creating so many layers as you're talking. There are so many layers. And if you think of someone who, I'm going to say Meryl Streep, she always creates many layers to her work. There are many layers to what she's doing. Really excellent actors like yourself, you have layers. You build and you build and you build, and Shakespeare is that, the building of the layers, whether it's a sonnet, a monologue, whether it is the play, there are layers within it. I mean, just as you've been going through the sonnet, I'm thinking how brilliant he was, that each line had so many syllables that he had to stay within that framework. Mm-hmm. You know, he couldn't just write some, oh, okay. And then at the end, I'm going to let it rhyme. There's so much craft to that. There's so much time that's taken. So just stuff that's coming up to me. It's like, wow, this is really intense.
Yeah. And we either die by not observing it and knowing what it is, or we live by observing it and knowing what the hell we're doing with it, right? It's like if you jump into the ocean and you have little islands where you can stop and breathe so that you can get to the end of where you're swimming, you're fine if you stop at each one or at least every other one of those islands so you can take a little breath to continue. You're up shit creek. If you skip all the islands, and all you've got is the last, your final, and you're struggling, hoping you don't drown, right?
Right.
That's what breathing is. It's phrasing. That's what swimming to certain points to help you get your breath back, to be able to continue. That's what those are. Those are phrasing too. You could call that phrasing, phrase here at this island, phrase at the next one. You can skip that one and go to the next one. Unless you don't have the breath, and you phrase there too. Phrasing is very, very important. So, and there are many, many ways that you can phrase. What is really helpful is when you know what word or what syllable is on the stress after you've decided how you're going to express. So again, I took a breath after when, disgrace, eyes, I, alone, and state. Those are specific breaths. Now, someone might decide to do it differently, like it could be when in disgrace with breath. And this is not a bad, because we're always giving the impression that we're creating the thought, right? We're creating at the moment. We're not reciting something that like a parrot. There's no thought at all. That when in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast. Right? We're not doing that. We're not reciting. We're creating thought. So, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. So I took different breath. I took a breath after with, eyes. I took a breath after I and alone, and after beweep, and then the end of the line at state. So what it also does, it allows the actor to be affected by the material. If you're really creating the thought, that allows you to feel the material at a deeper level. when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, right? It allows feelings to come up without taking a lot of time, pausing here when, doing this affected stuff. Disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, right? Get that stuff. You don't need that. Now, what would not make sense, some breaths would not make sense. One would be maybe when breath in disgrace with fortune and breath. That's not a bad choice. When in disgrace with fortune and, now if you're really searching for it, right? Men's eyes, that can work. Specific choices that you make that allow you to phrase in such a way that it's a specific thought for you to express to an audience. And when you know the iambic pentameter rhythm, it just helps you when you're analyzing at the beginning, when you're trying to figure out what the heck am I saying here specifically, it helps you to find that. Let's go to the third line. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries.
He's a pitiful man. He's a pitiful man. That's all I have
He's
to
going
say.
through some hard times right now.
He is in despair. Help me, Jesus.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Heaven is deaf. So let's count the syllables. And, trouble, deaf, heaven with my bootless cries. There's 11 syllables, not 10.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 5.5 feet. If it was 12 syllables, it would be 6 feet, right? So pentameter, that means 5, right? Pentameter, a meter of 5 feet. Iambic is the stressed and unstressed rhythm. Iambic pentameter. If you wanted to make it 10, you could do a contraction on heaven, because often in Shakespeare, heaven is contracted into one syllable, heaven, heaven. The contraction after V, and so it would be HEV contraction N, heaven. That's often used by Shakespeare to make the line flow better. Let's read it in a pure iambic pentameter line. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. Cries is on the unstressed, right? Let's do it again. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. We don't pronounce heaven, heaven, right? Which is the way in a pure iambic pentameter line is the way that it's written right here. And trouble deaf heaven, instead of the emphasis on head of heaven, then falls on the stress. So what would happen if we contracted heaven and we did and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries? We have 10. We have 10 syllables. If we were to contract, and that's sometimes, especially in the plays, he'll use contracted words to help keep a more flow to the rhythm of the thought of the line. Okay, so nowhere in any text have I ever seen them contract heaven to make it one syllable. Because if you do, heaven falls on the unstressed, and it's too important to be unstressed. Think of the line without the word heaven. And trouble deaf with my bootless cries. You need heaven, right? It's so specific and needed in that line. It isn't contracted because it's too important. And trouble deaf heaven, even hair is on the unstressed. So it's very unusual. If we were to go back to doing an inversion, and trouble deaf, and then another inversion right after it. Deaf is on the stress. Let's put, instead of heaven on the heaven on the unstressed, let's make that an inversion. Heaven with my bootless cries. So it's an unusual line. Just by going through this and noting the unusual anomalies of this line helps us to be aware of it so that we can make specific choices to make sense of it, right? If you just know how to analyze it, you'll go, oh yeah, that's off. That's off. And so how am I going to express it now? It's not a pure iambic pentameter line. In fact, there's an extra syllable. How am I going to deal with it? So even the word bootless is pronounced bootless, but in a pure iambic pentameter line, it's bootless, because that's the end of the 10-syllable line. Cries is an extra syllable. And trouble, death, heaven with my bootless cries, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't pronounce bootless. You pronounce it bootless. Okay, so what is this guy doing? He's troubling deaf heaven. Heaven has no ear. It can't hear you. Bootless prayer. Bootless, in the CT Onions, I looked it up. Bootless means impotent, unavailing. And trouble deaf heaven with my unavailing cries. And trouble deaf heaven with my impotent cries. Why are they impotent? Because heaven has turned a deaf ear to you, to this person. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. This line has so many anomalies, and the actor has to be aware of it. And he has to be aware that if he were to do it in a pure iambic pentameter line, it would not make any sense at all. I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. That's how you would say it if it was in the pure iambic pentameter rhythm. You know it doesn't make sense that way. So the first 4 syllables you could invert. Heaven, I think, has to be another inversion because you don't pronounce it heaven. So you have 2 inversions in a row. And trouble deaf heaven with my, you hear that?
Mm-hmm.
It's 2 inversions in a row with my bootless cries. Now, what that does now is that puts cries, instead of ending on a unstressed syllable, it now ends on a stressed syllable. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. It's, if it was pure, it would be with my bootless cries. That's when you realize, okay, the iambic pentameter is not meant to be recited. There are thoughts overlaid on the rhythm that are more important than the, not that you would ever want to, recite strict iambic pentameter and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. So we don't, like I said, we don't express a rhythm. We express the thoughts on the rhythm, and the rhythm helps us find out what's going on here. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries is an unusual line, and we have to know where it goes off. It will help us to find the specific thought.
That's very important. We don't express the rhythm, we express the thoughts in the rhythm.
Yes. Count each syllable of each line. That's how you find out if there are anomalies. If we hadn't counted the syllables, we wouldn't know that there's 11 syllables in this line.
So when I am working on a sonnet, as I am preparing it, I am making my little marks to know where it's unstressed, where it's stressed. And then I'm adding my breaths in that. As I'm going through it, so I'm marking it so I can get used to it. Once I lay it down where I mark it up, kind of like when we're doing a scene and we're marking our beats, in this line, we have this beat, then we go to this beat. So it's similar in that I am marking my breaths, I'm marking my inflections, or I'm marking my stress. So that's part of my work as I am getting ready. Not later, but that's part of the beginning. Because I need to know that first before I start putting it in my body.
Yes, that's right.
Because to me, Shakespeare, it's its own language. It's kind of like if we got a job and we had to speak in Italian or French. it's another language, and you have to really understand that language in order to really do it justice. So I'm just trying to make sure that I understand the process of Shakespeare. What is Shakespeare, first of all? Because Shakespeare stands by himself, and his writing stands by itself. So what is it, and how do I attack it? I'm going to attack it differently than I do 5 lines on Beretta. I cannot do Shakespeare the way I tackle. Yo, bro, what's up? I can't. I just can't. I can't.
Yeah.
So it's important to know.
That's very good. This is all very good. Your questions are questions that need to be asked. Okay, so the third line, let's just review that. The first 4 syllables, and trouble, death, and trouble, death. I said that you could do an inversion if you thought and was more important than trouble. But if you choose not to do an inversion, it's a perfect iambic pentameter, 4 syllables. And trouble, death, and trouble, death, that's perfect, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even if you did do the inversion and gave and the stress, you're still back on rhythm on death. And trouble, death falls on the stress whether you invert it or not. Now, death, which naturally falls on the rhythm, on the stress of the rhythm, is followed by a word that has the stress on the first syllable. But that first syllable in the iambic pentameter rhythm is on an unstressed beat. And trouble, death, heaven, it's not pronounced that way, right? We don't pronounce
Mm-hmm.
heaven, heaven. So what are we going to do? Make another inversion, because that's the only way it will make sense. And trouble, death, heaven with my. Now, heaven with my, that's four syllables, an inversion. Heaven with my boot and my are both on the stress. The last syllable of the 4 and the first syllable of the following are both on a stress. And trouble, death, heaven with my boot, because we don't pronounce bootless, bootless, right? You just can't pronounce it that way. So it is on the stress following a natural stress. Boot is actually on the unstressed. By emphasizing or giving the stress on boot of bootless, then cries is also on the stress instead of ending on the 11th syllable, which would be an unstressed syllable. In the pure iambic pentameter rhythm, cries would fall on the 11th syllable, which is unstressed. It makes for a better line when you start adding these inversions. It helps you to express the thought, knowing that there are inversions here. And trouble, death, heaven with my bootless cries, or and trouble, death, heaven with my bootless cries, right? We're not expressing rhythm, we're expressing a thought. That's very important. That's why we count the syllables. We find out if there is a word that's pronounced in such a way that it makes no sense, then we find out how do we do it? Probably an inversion is what we're asking for. So the reason why I brought up the contraction on heaven is because it still would not be a perfect iambic pentameter line up to that point if we contracted it. And trouble, death, heaven with my bootless, right? So it just makes more sense to stay with the emphasis on hev of heaven in an inversion. Heaven with my bootless cries. That's why it's necessary to go through this kind of analysis. So now let's continue with the fourth line. It starts off with another and. Let's count them first. And look upon myself and curse my fate. 10 syllables, perfect. Let's speak it as in the rhythm. And look upon myself and curse my fate. It's perfect. It makes perfect sense on the rhythm. There's no word that's pronounced differently because of the stress falling on the wrong part of the rhythm. And look upon myself and curse my fate. Perfect. So that's the end of the first quatrain, the first 4 lines. Now we go into the second quatrain, which has a different rhyme scheme. So the first four would be A, B, A, B. Rhyme, different rhyme, rhyme, different rhyme. Okay, so the fifth line. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. 10 syllables. Okay. How do we pronounce wishing? Stress on the first syllable, right? We don't say wishing.
Right.
We say wishing me like is an inversion, another inversion. Because to keep it on this strict iambic pentameter rhythm would be wishing me like, and that makes no sense. You got to know where those inversions are. Wishing me like. Now you're back on the stress, on the pure stress of the rhythm. Like falls on the rhythm. Even though you've inverted it, you're back on the pure iambic pentameter rhythm on like. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. Perfect iambic pentameter line. If you're inverting, you have to invert the first four syllables. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. Okay, here's another thing I'm going to throw at you that we'll look at in more depth. You have 8 monosyllabic words. Wishing is 2. The other 8 words are monosyllabic. I believe Shakespeare writes it that way because you have the freedom to give as many stresses for the expression. For instance, wishing me like to one more rich in hope. Each one of those are on a stress, right? Because it's a perfect iambic pentameter line, you're always going to end up on the stress at the end of the line, which is the case with iambic pentameter. The 10th syllable is always on the stress. Hope. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. You could do it that way. It's a good choice. You're wishing for this. I'm wishing that I could be like someone who's rich in hope. When I looked up hope, because obviously you think you know what it means, and it's pretty much the same usage back then as it is now. It just means that you're not hopeless, and it means a person who's rich in hopefulness. So he has this person that he's wishing he could be like, this one person that he wishes he could be like, is rich in hope, an outlook on life that is hopeful, right? Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. No matter what you emphasize, it's almost like you can't go wrong with a series of monosyllabic words. I believe it has to be 3 in a row, 3 monosyllabic words in a row. So instead of bum bum, it is bum bum bum. So wishing me like to one more rich in hope is now changed to wishing me like to one more rich in hope. You would never express it that way, but there is an impetus that if you give each one of those words equal emphasis, it really does something to the person who's performing it. It doesn't mean you have to, because even if you kept with the pure iambic pentameter rhythm, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, that's not giving each word, each monosyllabic word, the equal emphasis. So you might want to go back on the give in hope. In would be on the unstressed. So you could still give equal emphasis to all the monosyllabic words except for in, and hope falls on the end of the line, which has a natural stress anyway. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. In hope. Or wishing me like to one more rich in hope. They both make sense. So let's go on to the next line. Let's count them. Featured like him with friends possessed. 10 syllables. The first word, again, we don't pronounce it featured, we pronounce it featured, right? So we have an inversion written into it just by the pronunciation of the word. Featured like him is on the stress, and it makes sense that him would be stressed. Featured like him with friends possessed. Him, friends, and zest of possessed are on the stress. So it makes sense to start off with the inversion, featured like, because you can't say featured like him with friends possessed. Featured like him with friends possessed. Now, this him, it's a choice that the actor has to make. Is it the same person he's talking about? Or is it two different people? Featured like him, featured in this sense, which I looked up in The Onion, means having an outward appearance that you envy, that you wish you could have. Featured like him, to look like him, and like him with friends possessed. Is it the same person? Does this person have so many friends because of the way he looks? Or is it two different people? We have to make that choice. If it's two different people, then the emphasis has to be different. Featured like him with friends possessed. They both make sense. Which one is better expressed is a choice that the actor has to make. If it's the same person, featured like him with friends possessed, that's one person that you're talking about, right? It makes perfect sense like that, and it's a much easier way to express it. Featured like him with friends possessed. If you wanted to break it up so that it's two different people, featured like him with friends possessed. Featured looking like him with friends possessed. Two different people. That makes sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
I've gone both ways on this line ever since I learned this sonnet, let's see, 53 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, because sometimes I feel like it's two different people, but sometimes I think, no, it's got to be the same person.
Well, it depends, right? It depends on the character, how he's viewing the world. It
Yes.
has to do how he's viewing the world, because he's seeing everybody else is doing well and he's not.
Yes.
Or he's seeing Johnny down the street is doing well and I'm not. He's hearing his prayers, but not mine. So it just depends on the frame of mind you're in, where you wake up that morning, yeah, everybody, God's listening to everybody but me. You know, what is your thought process, and who are you obsessing on that is doing better than you?
Context, right?
Yes.
So in the first line of the second quatrain, he's saying, wishing me like to one more rich in hope. So he's now continuing this thought of what he's wishing for. Wishing me like one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope. With what I most enjoy, contented least. So, yeah, he's describing aspects of people that he wishes were part of him, because he's in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, as far as he's concerned.
And how many times we actors feel like everybody's doing well but me, everybody's getting those big jobs but me, everybody at my agency is going out on interviews but me. You know, it's the woe is me. I mean, that's really what he's saying is, everybody, they're all doing it, I'm not. You know, it's and as an actor, how we relate to that, you know, because most of us relate to that.
Yes, as an actor or as just your regular human being going through life, right?
Yeah.
Regular human being.
That's why we need Jesus.
That's right. That's right. And that's where the ending of this sonnet, that thought that you just had right now, comes into play. So we did the inversion, featured like him. Now we're back on the rhythm. Featured like him with friends possessed. Perfect, right? Even after the inversion. Okay, so the next line, let's count it first. Desiring this man's art and that man's scope. 10 syllables. Desiring this man's art and that man's scope. What I noticed about desiring is that often we say desiring. We add an extra syllable. Desiring. That's the way most people would say it, right? Desiring. Here, you can't do that because you'd throw off the whole thing. It would be an 11-syllable line instead of a perfect 10-syllable line. Desiring this man's art and that man's scope. Okay, so he's still enumerating things that he wishes for, or that he's desiring this man's art. Now, does that mean he wants to be a painter?
No.
No, I mean,
he wants the riches. He wants the good things in life, right?
well, but specifically, desiring this man's art, this man's skill, this man's learning, desiring this man's skill, and that man's scope. So what does scope mean? A freedom, a liberty of not being restrained or unhampered in thought. So you're free. Your mind is free to accept and deal with anything that your imagination goes to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Desiring this man's art, skill, and that man's freedom to think, to let his imagination go wild. So desiring this man's art and that man's scope is the rhythm. The expression is something different. Desiring this man's art, breath, and that man's scope, breath. And then the next line, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Another perfect 10-syllable line. Do we have another inversion here, or do we need another inversion? What is your choice? With what I most, or is it with what I most? Right?
Mm-hmm.
They both work. Personally, I would go with what? With what I most enjoy, contented least. That thing that he loves the most, because of where he is now in his life, he gets no contentment out of it at all. I hate acting. Or if you're a musician, I hate composing. I don't even want to hear music. I don't even want to go to the theater. I don't want to see a movie, right? With what I most enjoy, contented least. That's pretty clear. And that's the end of the second quatrain. So the whole second quatrain is wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least.
With that line, he could be talking about three different people. We go back to the choices, or he could be focused on that one guy who seems to have it all. He's got the talent, he's got the good, and he's got the vision. He's got the freedom to just create as much as he wants.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. You could look at it that way. That's a great choice. It makes perfect sense. So that's the end of the second quatrain. Now, the third one, let's count the first line. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, 11 syllables again. That's good to know. So what they call it when you read something in the perfect iambic pentameter rhythm, they call it scanning. So you're actually scanning for anomalies. You're scanning for things that are out of the rhythm. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising. On a 10-syllable line, spies would be on the stress, but of course ing is there, so you have ing is at the end of the line, and it's an added syllable. Now we know it's 11. There's got to be some inversions here, probably. Is it yet in these thoughts, or is it yet in these thoughts? Which one do you choose? It's up to the actor, right? They both make sense. Is there one of the two that is a better choice? I think yet. So you've had two quatrains on his state of being and what he wishes for. And yet now add something different, right? Even with all that, yet you're now looking for something to come after yet. Yet is like putting a stop sign up to a speeding vehicle and go, what? Right? You see this vehicle going like that and like that and like that, and then yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yet in these thoughts, that would be the inversion. You're back on the stress on thoughts. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising myself. So, yet in these thoughts, self of myself is on the stress. We've finished thoughts on the stress, and it's a pure iambic pentameter stress on thoughts. Yet in these thoughts, myself, but we have almost following it. It's almost exactly what happened with bootless cries.
Mm-hmm.
Yet in these thoughts, myself, self is on the stress, almost is on the stress too, because that's how it's pronounced. It's not almost, it's almost, right?
Mm.
I don't know too many people that would say, I'm almost there.
Right, right.
Hang on, I'm almost there. Almost, right? Almost despise, that's an inversion of just those four syllables. Almost despising at the end of the line, which is the 11th syllable. We know that it's not a perfect iambic pentameter line. We've now figured out where the inversions need to go to help us express the line. Let's do it without the inversion at the top. And again, we have a monosyllabic series of 3 or more monosyllabic words. So you could go, yet in these thoughts, equal emphasis, right? To give it more power, more emotion. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, we're back on the rhythm. Myself is back on the rhythm, but then we have the new inversion that's coming with almost because of the way almost is pronounced. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising. So almost despise is the new inversion. It's just like what happened with and troubled deaf heaven with my bootless cries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have 11 syllables instead of 10 in the natural iambic pentameter line. The line is falling on an unstressed syllable, which is not the way iambic pentameter is. The end of the line is always meant to be on the stress, unless Shakespeare does something like this, where he adds an extra syllable. Even if you did the inversion at the top, yet in these thoughts, if you gave yet an emphasis and the rest of those monosyllabic words equal emphasis with more emphasis on yet in these thoughts equal right emphasis, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. You can hear the rhythm. So we're learning about how we have to count the syllables. We have to try to figure out by the way the words are spoken when there's an inversion so that we're not mispronouncing words. Okay, so the next line. Haply I think on thee and then my state. Perfect 10 syllables. Haply is pronounced haply, not haply. So we have another inversion right at the top again. Haply I think you would never emphasize I, the pronoun, because it's not even on the stress. So you couldn't say, happily I think on thee, and then my state. It sounds wrong, and it is wrong. You don't have to make the I an emphasis because we know who you're talking about. There's not another person that we're talking about that just entered into the context of happily I think on thee and then my state. So you have that inversion at the top, and then it's a perfect iambic pentameter rhythm to the end of the line. Happily I think on thee and then my state, right?
Mm-hmm.
Continuing the thought, like to the lark at break of day arising. Another 11-syllable line. Would you say like to the lark, or would you say like
Like to.
like to the lark at break of day arising, arising from, we have another inversion coming up with from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ending despising with the extra unstressed syllable of zing on despising, we start off with the stressed syllable on hap. So you have a perfect iambic pentameter, 12 syllables if you count hap. Yet in the thoughts myself almost despising hap, haply I think with the inversion, think is on the stress, and even in the pure iambic pentameter rhythm, think is on the stress. Haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from, he's saying, just like a lark that arises at the break of day. Happily in this sense doesn't mean happily. It means happenstance, perchance. Perhaps I think on thee. Haply, perchance I think on thee, and then my state, just like a lark arising at the break of day, like to the lark at break of day arising from, arising, zing is on the unstressed, but from is starting a new inversion. From is on the stress. From sullen earth, that's the inversion. From sullen earth instead of from sullen earth. I don't think you would say it that way. From sullen, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sul. You could. It's a choice, right? They both could work.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the actor's choice. Like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth. Well, sullen is very important too. Sullen earth is sullen in the sense of melancholy, mournful, dark, gloomy, dull, somber. Like to the lark at break of day, arising, getting away from sullen earth and singing hymns at heaven's gate. If we did an inversion on like to the lark at break of day arising, you still have that extra syllable. From sullen earth, you pronounce sullen, sullen. So the first syllable of sullen is on the stressed in a perfect iambic pentameter line. From sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate. Perfect 10-syllable line. And then you've got the couplet at the end. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Each one of the lines in the couplet is perfect 10-syllable line, and they rhyme. So you have 3 quatrains of 4 lines each, making 12 lines. Now we're adding the last 2, which would make it a full 14 lines of a sonnet. Let's count them. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings. And you've got a monosyllabic series here of 3 or more words where you can give equal emphasis. For thy sweet love, for thy sweet love, for thy sweet love, for thy sweet love. Thy is so important to the sense of the thought. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings. The last line is, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Perfect 10-syllable line. That then I scorn to change my state with kings. Each one of those words that fall on the stress are important. Unless you wanted to invert, that then I scorn, instead of that then I scorn. I think keeping it on the perfect iambic pentameter rhythm probably makes more sense. But then we have another choice here because we have a monosyllabic series of 3 or more monosyllabic words, right? So that can help you express it in a different way altogether. That then I scorn. Scorn is back on the rhythm. That then I scorn to change my state with kings. That whole line is monosyllabic. So it gives you huge freedom. Going back to what you were talking about, you mentioned Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. It's not capitalized. Could it be a woman? Could it be a man? Could it be someone else? Haply I think on thee. And then my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns. What is a hymn?
A song. Yeah, a song.
You sing it in church, or you sing it at Heaven's Gate. You sing a hymn at Heaven's Gate. You don't sing a rock and roll song at heaven, right? You sing a hymn meant specifically for worship, right? It's not capitalized, which would make it very specifically God. But I think that there were political reasons why Shakespeare decided to do it this way. For thy is on the stress, sweet love remembered, such wealth brings that then I scorn to change my state with kings. So he's gone through this amazing emotional adventure in these 14 lines where he's ready to he's at the bottom of the barrel of life, of his life.
It's quite an emotional roller coaster ride that he's going through. It reminds me of a psalm. In a lot of the psalms, David starts out wailing and bemoaning and wanting to get even with whoever is messing with him. And then at the end, he calms down, and at the end, he comes to his senses that I know it is well. He goes from spiraling to then anchoring himself in the love that, I remember now. I remember. And without him even knowing, he has come to the place of hope. Love is that thing that is, we're hopeful in that euphoric love. And that's what it seems to me like he comes to his senses of, I have this.
He comes to his senses on yet, right? Desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet, that's the turn. All of the sonnets, you've got to find where the turn is, because it requires a different energy to continue. Yet, in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. And then my state, instead of what I started out in the state that I was in when I started, it now is like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. So I don't think it's just a woman.
Yeah, it feels like, when I read it, it felt like a talking to God, having that, pity party. We're in our woe is meism. We're not paying attention to the beauty around us. Then we get to vent all that toxicity. And then we come back to, wait a minute, I am blessed. I have good stuff. God, thank you. You are taking care of me. The remembrance of it.
Remembering you and what wealth you give to me makes me scorn all those people that I wished I was, even the king or a king. I scorn that for the wealth that you give me.
What I love about what you were saying is you have to read, you have to count the syllables, you have to mark it up, you have to do your breath work, and then you have to start, as you're doing that, start finding your choices. This isn't 10, but it's 11. So then I've got to find where I'm going to put the inversion in order to make it all come together. It really started to speak to me in a whole different way, because I think sometimes you talk about lazy actors, but sometimes we're fearful. We're fearful of something because Shakespeare feels so big that, oh my God, that's beyond me. I don't think I can even contemplate or consider doing Shakespeare, I'm having a hard time just memorizing my 5 lines for Beretta. How am I going to get to Shakespeare? But what, as you were going on, what came to me was that if I start applying the discipline of learning Shakespeare and really take in everything you said, which was start with the syllables, mark the inversions, put the breath in, and understanding what you are saying to make sure that you are going to your dictionary and really getting a sense of what each word is so that you can then create the thought instead of memorizing just by rote, but creating the thought. So if I know what hope is, and I know what sullen means, and I know what does heaven really mean, because sometimes we think we know words. Oh, I know what love is. Well, wait a minute. Have you really looked at the definition of love? What is it?
And it can change depending on the context, right? But also, don't forget, this is really important. Whenever you find 3 or more monosyllabic words, you have a freedom. It gives you more freedom to express. I mean, there's a lot of freedom no matter what, once you know how to do it, once you've analyzed it correctly, and then you're free to express it any way you want. When you have 3 or more monosyllabic words, it gives you another choice, another possibility of enlarging the emotional journey that you're on. Instead of happily I think on thee, and then my state like to the lark at break of day. Happily I think on thee, and then my state like to the lark. All monosyllabic words, right? Like to the lark at break of day, arising. Now, arising is the first polysyllabic word that you've come to after a huge run of monosyllabic words. So it's like going from the rhythm going bum 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 or bum 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 bum. You're going bum 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 like you would hear in a symphony. Anyway, so the series of 3 or more monosyllabic words is really important, and they should be marked also. And then once you've done all that work and you understand the sonnet, because this applies also to verse in the plays, you would do the same thing if you were working on to be or not to be. You would do the same thing, the same work, and you would find out where all those anomalies are. There are a lot of them in that particular soliloquy. It gives you the roadmap from where to start to make your choices. And then Shakespeare starts to lose its mystery. You're no longer intimidated by it. There's a system by which you can learn it.
This has been wonderful. And I have been pondering this for a while because I find that actors who are fluent in Shakespeare are able to take any piece of material and really elevate it. Whereas actors who don't get roles as the lead, they're doing under fives, or they're doing just one role, one small role here, one small role there. They never get to grow because they're like, okay, well, this is what, this is all I do. But when you start to think in terms of training and working on Shakespeare, it frees you in a different way. It gives you a better understanding of the text, the analysis of it. You're not just we started the conversation off with actors not looking at the whole script. They're just looking at their lines, and you should know the whole script, even if you only have 5 lines, even if you only have a scene, to know where you fit in the story. Where does your character fit? So this has been amazing.
You're right. Once you've really ingrained working like this, and you're free in Shakespeare, you pick up any television script, movie script, anything, and you know how to analyze it. You have a way of analyzing that, and you can see, wow, there's 5 monosyllabic words here. This is stuff that we use in real life. Hey man, get out of here! 5 monosyllabic words, right? Hey man, get out of here. You could do it that way too. But if it calls for something else and those are the lines that you're given, hey man, get out of here, right? There's an impetus of having monosyllabic words in a row that you can use. And the same with inversions, the same, I mean, it all applies. Shakespeare is like lifting 500 pounds, and then you do television and they ask you to lift 150. So Shakespeare, television, yeah, no problem. And I'm not denigrating television. I'm just saying that you want to give the same kind of attention to your television and movie texts that you would a Shakespearean text, and you can do it with much more confidence and a more idea of the possibilities that are there in the text once you've worked on Shakespeare in such an exacting system. I mean, I learned this from some great Shakespearean teachers, and that's how I learned it. I didn't just come up with this. I've never heard anybody talk about the three or more monosyllabic words, but I think it's right. I'm the only one that I've ever heard come up with that, but I think it really helps.
It makes it digestible. Because before this call, I was like, oh my God, this is huge. I was reading the sonnet. I looked up what the meaning was. In having you go through it, I have such a better understanding now. And it's giving me a different opinion than certain people can do Shakespeare and others can't. It really is a practice. You have to practice. It's like anything. You have to put the time in it. And Shakespeare isn't, you don't learn Shakespeare in a day. We did a little mini workshop here, but you don't, it takes time. Just like being an actor takes time. You learn not to just regurgitate the material that you've memorized, but you start to give it layers. And we didn't even talk about the body. What are we doing as we're talking, as we're giving this information? Because we're not just standing, we're in motion, we're in action. Maybe next time we can bring some action to it, so it's alive.
I'll bring my ballet tights.
For that actor who has been with us through this, what would you recommend they do next?
I would recommend picking another sonnet, read through several of them, find one that really speaks to you, a sonnet that you really, really love, and then break it down just like we did. Review this video if you get stuck. This was the first sonnet that I learned many years ago, and it spoke to me. It really spoke to me. I was reading through some, and this is the one that went, whoa, and there are so many that do that to you.
And is there a book of sonnets? Like if I go to Barnes and Nobles, can I just go looking for Shakespeare sonnets?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So many to choose from.
Wasn't that amazing? Oh my God. Robert Beltran is fire. And he just loves Shakespeare so much that it goes in your bones. Well, let me know what you think of the interview in the comments below. And while you're at it, can you buy me a coffee? Actually, buy me a hot latte. I love me some coffee, especially right about now. Don't go anywhere, because coming up next is a conversation I have with another extraordinary actor by the name of Marcelo Tubert. Check it out.